Good evening and welcome to Liberal Arts in Action, a program of the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts at Loyola Marymount University. This has been a series that we started this summer to share the information and the wisdom of our wonderful scholars at LMU. My name is Dr. Deanna Cook and I serve as BCLA's Director of Engaged Learning. The series is designed for some of you to be a preview if you are incoming students or folks who have not had a chance to take courses by our esteemed Dr. Guerra. And for some of you, it is a reminder of what is still available here at LMU. Perhaps you're an alum. But this is an opportunity to see how our disciplines create a thought-provoking, well-reasoned explorations of a variety of topics. And we do this by highlighting our faculty and some of our staff members. To get us started, I just want to remind you that we have added another workshop. It will be next Monday at 12 noon with Dr. Ines Kelly in the Department of Economics. Dr. Kelly is a health economist and we'll be in discussing the unintended consequences of COVID-19 on health, physical health, economy, and education, and how all of these things are really interrelated with one another. But today we have the distinct honor and pleasure of welcoming Dr. Fernando Guerra, who is the director of the Center for the Study of Los Angeles in the Department of Political Science. Dr. Guerra will discuss a really interesting topic and very timely with all the things that are happening right now in our election season related to voter suppression and the Latino community. Dr. Guerra is an expert on electoral politics and leads key exit polls for local elections in Los Angeles. He participates in various committees, commissions, and panels, and is asked to speak regularly on the topics related to his expertise. So today we're really looking forward to an interesting dialogue and discussion with Dr. Guerra. So Dr. Guerra will present. There is a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions, you can ask them in the Q&A section. He will answer them. You can also chat and we will respond to those questions as well. We're gonna leave about 20 minutes at the end to really begin to respond to those questions. So thank you and welcome, Dr. Guerra.
Thanks for having me. I greatly appreciate this opportunity. For many of you who know me, this is my pandemic goatee. In my entire life, I've never actually had a beard or a goatee, but I took the opportunity to do that. I was actually thinking about shaving it off before this presentation, but my wife encouraged me to keep it off. She said it's a little bit of variety. So I don't know what she was talking about there, but we'll see that. What I'm going to do today is I've been studying Latino political inclusion for over 30 years. And a lot of the presentation, a lot of my early work was about the exclusion of Latinos in public office and the political system. And oftentimes, including some of my analysis, we were really looking at the Latino community and the characteristics of the Latino community. What I want to do in this presentation is really turn it around and take a look at the characteristics of the political system and the impact that they have on Latinos. Let's see the next slide. And you see that the title says vote delusion, vote suppression, vote exclusion. All of the things really kind of mean the same thing. So you're diluting the vote, you're suppressing the vote, but the term that's really taken on right now is really vote suppression. And so the question I'm asking is, the question is, why do Latinos vote less than other groups? We can have the next slide, Alejandra. And so Latinos vote at lower level than other voters. And we have all kinds of data that give us that indication, but the question is why? Why people are asking. In this presentation, I'll focus on the characteristics, not of Latinos, but the characteristics of the electoral system. And I specifically focus on California and Los Angeles. And I'm doing this for two reasons. Number one, everyone usually takes a look at the internal characteristics of the Latino community. I'm going to make the assumption, after many years of studying, that there's really nothing in the internal characters of Latinos that's keeping them from voting. And I'll make a couple of observations regarding this. If you take a look at Latin American countries and you compare them to the turnout in the United States, many of these countries, if not in fact most of these countries, have higher turnout than we do in the United States. In other words, in Latin America, people vote, and they vote to a greater degree than Americans do. Another case would be Puerto Rico. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, from let's say the 1950s to 2000, if Puerto Rico were a state, it would have had a turnout higher than half the states. And then all of a sudden you have Puerto Ricans leave Puerto Rico, go to New York. Remember, they're still US citizens. They don't have to go through immigration process. They can register to vote the minute they land in New York, New Jersey, Florida, what have you, but yet they land there and then they vote at a much greater level. The same population, the same internal characteristics, but their voter participation is cut in half from Puerto Rico to New York, or Puerto Rico to New Jersey, or Puerto Rico to Florida. And so it's not the population characteristics that work here. And then why California and Los Angeles? California and Los Angeles right now have the reputation of being incredibly inclusive political system. You know, we have 3 Latinos elected statewide. We've had a Latino mayor in Los Angeles, San Jose, Long Beach, etc. Latinos make up about 26% of the registered voters now, and they're proportionate to their voter registration levels. They have representation in the state legislature, on city councils, etc. And so it's seen California and Los Angeles as a very inclusive system. They basically have adopted all of the rules to overcome obstacles and create inclusion that can be adopted. California may not have been the first state to, for instance, have universal vote by mail, but we now have that. California may not have been the first state to have online voter registration, but we have that. And so California has a reputation of adopting just about every progressive, inclusive piece of legislation that exists. And so in this incredibly inclusive regime, there is still voter suppression happening, and in a systematic fashion. And that's why I want to focus it on this way. Next slide. And so we're asking let's take a look at the next slide. Yeah. So we're asking the question, why is voter turnout so low in California? And there are 3 very general reasons for this. One is the progressive era electoral structures, the lack of reinforcing institutions, and then no ideological distinctions in contemporary politics. Now, voter era electoral structures, let's talk a little bit about those. Let's take a look at the next slide, Ale. Here what we're talking about is that progressives, not the way we use the word today, but really the progressives of about 100 years ago, really the progressives that were part of the amendment that led to women voting, that led to many of the political reforms that continue to exist to this day. And these were actually, the progressives were actually the progressives within the Republican Party. So like Teddy Roosevelt or Hiram Johnson, who was governor of California, and then also a vice presidential nominee. These individuals wanted to really change the political system and not have it be captured by the political party or what they considered ethnic political machines like you had in the East Coast. And when they talked about ethnic, they weren't talking about Latino, Blacks, or Asians. They were talking about Italians, Jews, Irish. And they felt that those individuals had had a negative impact because of political machines. So they were trying to build electoral structures that would prevent the concentration of power. These seemed very progressive, but they ended up having unintended consequences for the inclusion of Latinos, Blacks, Asians, women, and others in later decades. And what are these? For instance, nonpartisan elections. And by nonpartisan elections, it means that candidates run without the party label. So if you live in California, It's in the state constitution that below the state legislature, meaning offices for county, city council, school board, that those offices are nonpartisan and don't have a party label. So you do not know if that candidate is a Republican or Democrat. And one of the things we know in political science is that the number one cue that voters take into the voting booth is partisanship. In other words, they may not know anything about a candidate, but if they see it's a Democrat or Republican, they're going to vote for that Republican because they're registered Republican and they believe in those values, or they're going to vote for that Democrat. Without that cue, they have no sense of who they should vote for. And in fact, today, we know that this is a heavily Democratic state, and we're overwhelming number of Democrats in the congressional delegation because we vote for those based on party. We have overwhelming number of Democrats in the state legislature because we vote for those based on party. And even the statewide offices, all like governor, lieutenant governor, the US senator, all 10 of the statewide offices are held by Democrats. But when you get to the county and the council level, there's actually overrepresentation of Republicans because people continue to vote for some of them without knowing their party. Incredible impact that nonpartisan elections have. And then we have what's called off-year, off-cycle elections, meaning that the progressives believe that city politics was very important and they should not be on the same election cycle as the federal elections for Congress or the state legislature. And so right now in 2020, we're having a national election, but the progressives believe that city and school board elections and county elections should be in 2019 or 2021, not 2020. And that has actually been changed, and we're going to take a look at that, and it has had a tremendous impact on the election of Latinos and others. Another progressive reform is the at-large election. Most cities in California are actually at-large. That's recently been changed because of some laws that have been passed, but historically, for the last 100 years, over 90% of California cities had at-large elections. What did that mean? Let's say a city has 5 council members, like right next to Loyola Marymount University, there's Culver City or El Segundo or Manhattan Beach or Santa Monica. All of these cities have 5 council members, some of them 7, but let's just stick with 5. It meant that all 5, that every single voter in the entire city would vote for all 5 positions. You would not divide them into districts. And so there was only one electorate. It was a city-wide electorate. And so even if you had a growing minority population, let's say 15%, 20%, even 40% or 50% Latino, that all positions, if people voted on the basis of race, that all positions would still be held by one group, meaning whites. And so it was not unusual to have many cities that were 50, and sometimes because Latinos are younger and under the age of 18 to a greater proportion, many times because Latinos, many of them are still not citizens, you could have a population, a city with 60, 70% Latino population, okay? But yet the registered voter population would only be about 40%, given the youth and the immigrant status of a large part of that population. And if there was a vote by ethnicity, Latinos would have no representation in that city. Imagine that, 70%, but yet no representation. That's not a theory. That is actually what historically happened throughout Southern California and California in general. And that was a total exclusion of Latinos, basically based on this one law of at-large elections. Then the other thing, that we have too many elections. In California, we went very happy to have school boards get elected directly. So for instance, today in New York, the school board is not elected. It's actually appointed by the mayor. But here in Los Angeles, the school board is directly elected. We elect water boards, we elect library boards, we elect all kinds of different individuals, and therefore that's much more information, much more voting that you have to have. And sometimes we end up with too many elections, and people just feel there's an election not only every year, but oftentimes 6 months apart. One time we did a study, and there was one area of the city of Los Angeles that had to go vote 7 times in a 13-month period, including some special elections. And of course, that just wears out the electorate and further dilutes or depresses the vote. Staggered terms. What is staggered terms? Think about the US Senate and the US House of Representatives. The US House of Representatives, Congress, they get elected every 2 years, and the terms are not staggered. All 435 members of the US House of Representatives get elected every 2 years. The US Senate, on the other hand, has staggered terms, and that means that only a third of the Senate is up every 2 years. So today, in 2020, about a third of the US Senate will be up. Now, what is the impact on this? The impact is that when a movement happens, and a major movement to really change the people in power, it can't happen in one election. It has to happen over 3 elections in the US Senate. Well, at the city level, if you stagger terms, it then has to happen over 2 elections. And if anything is that we know about mobilization is that as hard as it is to mobilize, it's even harder to sustain that mobilization. And so that becomes problematic. And finally, also want to talk about direct democracy, something that we in California love, which is propositions. And propositions that we're going to vote again on November 3rd of this year. There's going to be 12 propositions. We love this direct democracy. But in a sense, what the direct democracy is an at-large election at the state level. And during this transition, as California was becoming more democratic, Republicans, while they still had control kind of at the state level, put on all kinds of initiatives that then restricted the possibility of the state legislature enacting certain laws. So for instance, they put a Proposition 187, the infamous anti-immigrant initiative in 1994. They then put an anti-affirmative action, Proposition 209 in 1996. And then in 1998, they put an anti-bilingual initiative. These were all statewide at-large elections where the electorate was still favorable to more conservative, more Republican voters to restrict the ability of the state legislature to formulate certain public policies, even though by that time, the state legislature, which was elected by districts, had already become more democratic, more liberal. What we've seen in the past elections is the overturning of those initiatives. So 2 years ago, Ricardo Lara, who's now insurance commissioner, sponsored an initiative to overturn the 1998 law, Proposition 227, that was anti-bilingual education. This election in 2020, there will be Proposition 16. That proposition simply says we're going to overturn Proposition 209, the anti-affirmative action proposition, and allow for, it doesn't mandate affirmative action, it allows for affirmative action. So you can see that direct democracy, while on the surface appears to be something very democratic, it has anti-democratic tendencies. Also, it's being completely distorted now in that it's not the people who put these initiatives on the ballot, but major corporations. Again, you're going to see a Proposition 22 on the ballot in November that was basically funded by Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash, and they are spending over $100 million to overturn a law that the state legislature passed. And it's basically the case with most propositions now, that is the amount of money that you have. Finally, in most of these cities, we don't have a directly elected mayor. We're used to, in the city of Los Angeles, where we elect the mayor like Eric Garcetti or Antonio Villaraigosa directly. But in most cities, you don't do that. You actually just vote for council members, and then the council amongst themselves vote for who's going to be mayor that year. What's the impact on that? We tend to know who the executive is. We tend to say we focus on Trump, we focus on Newsom, we focus on Eric Garcetti, and we want action from them. And when you don't know who the mayor is, it makes it very difficult. and it actually has the impact of reinforcing this delusion, this voter suppression. Next, please, to the next slide. In addition to these formal structures that I just finished talking about, we also have no reinforcing institutions, meaning that we have a lack of information. We have the decline of local news and political news. Yes, we still have the LA Times and KPCC, KCRW, and by the way, a new player in local news, which I think has been really fantastic in covering politics and local issues, is Spectrum News One. But of course, only if you subscribe to Spectrum do you get that. And so there's been a tremendous amount of decline of local news. And further, these audiences have been fragmented. Many of us are familiar that some people only watch Fox, others only watch MSNBC or CNN, so there's been a fractured. But it is ironic that while I say there's decline in local news, there are more news sources. It is easier to find information out than ever before, but not curated information, not intentional information about what's going on in your city or your neighborhood. That's much more difficult. Second is the lack of mobilizing institutions. What I mean by that is that there is no central location where you have somebody in charge to get the vote out. And so we depend on the political party, but it's minimal. It all depends on what the races are. Unions have really taken on that role, and they play a very important part. So do nonprofits, like let's say the Southwest Voter Registration Education, and then also leadership, meaning that the candidates themselves, even if they don't have a competitive race, they will really focus on getting the vote out. A final lack of institution is just the sense of ideological distinction. If we could have the next slide, Ale. And here, I'm talking about that we've really become a one-party state. We are heavily democratic. And we are heavily democratic because there is a broad consensus amongst residents, amongst voters, of where the state should be going. Many conservatives complain that California and the political leadership of Newsom, the state legislature, is taking us further left and further left than ever before. In fact, Newsom, the state legislature, is nowhere near as left as voters and residents of California are. If you do survey after survey, which we do at the Center for the Study of LA, you will see that the voters want this progressive legislation, and they push for it. And California is not unique. Let's take a look at, for instance, the state of Utah, but from the opposite perspective. They have tremendous consensus about some conservative ideas, and they expect their legislators, and I would argue that in Utah, it's the reverse, where the residents and the voters are even more conservative than, let's say, a Mitt Romney and others who represent them. And so we are finding that throughout most of the United States, the vast majority of states are one-party states, and the ones that aren't is what we call the battleground states. And so California is not unique. For instance, the state of Hawaii, believe it or not, there's not a single elected Republican in their state legislature. In their last session, they had one Republican state legislator, and he lost. So that one person, he was basically the whole party. He was the party leader. He caucused every time he talked to himself. It was a very different dynamic in Hawaii. And again, what we're seeing in California is not unique. And it's a one-party state, meaning that we have great consensus. And you can see it here just in Los Angeles in terms of the liberal progressive beliefs that we hold, okay? So given this, that we have these old electoral laws, if we can go to the next slide, Ale, we have these electoral laws, we have these reasons. So what do? How do we increase the vote? Because we do have, we hover around 70% for national elections, and then it goes down to some very low numbers for other types of elections, and especially for Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, the youth, and poor. These groups need to participate to a greater degree, and they do participate to a greater degree in many different electoral structures. And so it's not inherent that you're going to vote less because you're Latino. It is my argument that it is the political structures that create and suppress that participation. So we have some recommendations. And here I'm going to talk about some conventional recommendations and then unconventional recommendations. And conventional recommendations are those that have been tried or implemented in other states or have recently been implemented in California. And I'm talking about very recent. Some of these will be implemented for the first time in this election or the 2018 election or the primary we just had in March. These are very recent. So number one is online registration. Right now, while you're watching this and you really get bored, you can actually go on and register to vote online. Now understand then that you are going to have to show your ID the first time you go to vote, but not after that. If you still can't get around to registering online or registering early by mail or going to the DMV, the day of the election, you can go to a vote center and register and vote that same day. Yes, you will be given a provisional ballot until they verify everything, but you can vote and register that same day, and that started this election cycle. Third, which is basically known as the Mortar Voter Bill, that was national, but it's really been further improved in here in California, is universal registration with opt-out. What that means is that before last year, when you went to the DMV, they would ask you, do you want to register to vote? That meant that you were opting in. They were giving you the option to opt in and use that same information on your driver's license to register you to vote. The law has changed that now you have to opt out. Once you get a driver's license, you give them all that information, they will automatically register you to vote unless you opt out. That has made a tremendous difference. We further have created a law here in California where we pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds in high school. That doesn't mean they get to vote. We just pre-register them when they're in high school. We have them in civic classes. We give them something to do. They register, and as soon as they turn 18, their registration and their ballots start coming. And so that's been taken care of. We don't have to wait until they're out of high school and no longer in an institution which would encourage them to civically participate. In addition, on your ballot this November, and I encourage you to vote yes on this, is Proposition 18. Proposition 18 will give 17-year-olds the right to vote in a primary. Now, don't go crazy saying, I know a lot of 17-year-olds, they shouldn't vote, etc. The premise here is that, for instance, if you are 17 and you turn 18 right before November and you vote in the November election, those choices were already narrowed for you. You actually had limited choices because now you only get to vote for Biden or Trump. You did not get to vote in the primary for Sanders or for others. And so the thinking here is that if you're going to vote as an 18-year-old in November, you should have the right to select those choices. So this would give the right to any 18-year-old in November 3rd who is still 17 and was 17 on March 3rd when we held our primary. And so it's allowing only 17-year-olds who will turn 18 by November to vote in the primary. And that's on the ballot on 2020, and it'll be a very significant step for those 17-year-olds. If we can go to the next ballot. Again, I encourage you very much to vote yes on Proposition 18, and to, especially if you're LMU related, to get some of those, some of our first-year students who will do that. Other conventional recommendations here is early voting. Oftentimes we talked about, let's have a holiday. Well, I think California has gone even further. 10 days before election, there will be vote centers throughout the county that you can go and vote. And what's important about this, especially in this pandemic, if you still feel that you physically want to go vote and want to do it safe, go 10 days before, which is the whole week, entire week before, late October, you will be able to go to a vote center and vote in any vote center throughout the county. And that is a tremendous effort that they will have over 300 vote centers throughout the county, and that will rise to about 500 in this pandemic era. In March, they had close to 1,000 vote centers. Number two, which has obviously been in the news quite a bit, is universal vote by mail ballots. Now, Governor Newsom did sign an executive order that is having everybody get a universal vote by mail for this election, but that was already in the works in that several counties were starting to implement that. In Los Angeles County was not going to implement that for this November election, but it would have beginning in 2022. And so we will have universal vote by mail in California in several elections as gets implemented, but of course it's been implemented for 2020. There are many states, both conservative like Utah or liberal like Oregon, that have universal vote by mail. No fraud in either type of state has been found, and so I don't want to get into that whole debate because I'm sure you're hearing quite a bit about it right now. Touchscreen technology has been implemented in Los Angeles County, as have vote centers, as have multilingual services. The key thing about touchscreen technologies, it's not the internet. It's just you go and you vote. Many of you participated in March, and it's easier to vote, which this now allows us to program all the different elections. And so depending, it doesn't matter whether you live in Pomona and want to vote in Downey, or whether you live in Palmdale and you want to vote in Long Beach, it doesn't matter now, because no matter where they will be able to pull up through this touchscreen technology your specific ballot. And of course, vote centers have been established, and we talked quite a bit about that. We did an extensive study at the Center for the Study of Los Angeles. We actually interviewed in the March primary, over 3,500 voters as they came out of the polls and from these vote centers. And 95% of our respondents thought that the vote center idea was an improvement over the previous effort and the previous way of voting. There were problems with it. The press picked it up, and it was very minor in terms of 5%. But when you're talking about millions of voters, 5% is still a lot of people, and they're working on that. We can go to the next slide. Okay, further conventional recommendations is storing the voting rights of felons and parolees. There is nothing in the US Constitution that prevents felons or parolees from voting. As a matter of fact, there's nothing in the Constitution that prevents somebody currently in jail from voting. And states have only implemented these as a way to suppress the vote of African-American males and Latinos. As a matter of fact, there are 2 states in the United States where you can be in prison and you get to vote, okay? And guess what? Those 2 states are the 2 states that have the highest percentage of whites. One of the states is 97% white. The more African-American or Latinos you have, the more likely that the state prohibits you as a felon or a parolee from voting. And so it's clearly a direct attack on the votes of Latino and African Americans, these type of laws that exist. And so there is another proposition on the November ballot that further allows the incorporation of felons and parolees. I don't think it goes far enough, but I'm certainly going to be able to support it. Another conventional recommendation that greatly improves the voting system and the inclusion of Latinos and African Americans, and actually the election of Latinos and African Americans, is ranked choice voting. This is not a theory. This is actually practiced in San Francisco, Oakland, and even the state of Maine. And you could even think about the Iowa caucuses as ranked choice voting. What happens in the Iowa caucuses? Although it was a disaster this election cycle, what happens, people get together, they argue about who should vote, they all then separate and go to their different groups, and then what happens is they say, well, you guys, you only have 4 or 5 people, are you sure you don't want to go somewhere else? And then they go somewhere else. So what they're basically doing is getting to see what the results are to some extent and being able to give their vote to a different individual. This, I believe, would have prevented the election of Donald Trump if we had ranked choice voting. Throughout the early parts of the primaries in 2016, Donald Trump did not come close to having a majority of the vote. He didn't come close to even having 40% of the vote or even 30%. And sometimes he was winning primaries, winner take all, with less than 20% of the vote. In ranked choice voting, what you do is you say, I want to vote for candidate A, but if he doesn't make it, I want B and C. And then they count the votes. And then whoever has the least number of votes, they take those, whoever voted for him first, and then go to the second choice of all those voters and redistribute those votes. And then that allows for a more democratic way, and it doesn't allow for someone to win an entire election with less than 50% of the vote. It forces and it continues to eliminate candidates. Let's take a next one. All right, and then the California Voting Rights Act. Earlier, when I talked about the progressive reforms, I talked about at-large elections. This law basically says that if you can show that there is vote polarization, meaning that all the Latino neighborhoods voted for Latinos, but all the white neighborhoods voted for whites. So a vote polarization exists, and it usually does because of segregation, and that the system continues to discriminate against Latinos or African Americans, that you must change your at-large system to a district system. And that has been having tremendous impact. Over 30 cities just in the last 5 years have changed their voting system from at-large to district elections, and all of them have led to greater inclusion of Latinos and African Americans. And then I put on there the census, apportionment, redistricting, gerrymandering, and the Citizens Redistricting Commission. Obviously, we have to have a good census to have a count to figure out how to reapportion, and we're going through that, and we all know the issues that are happening there. And of course, there's a tremendous undercount, which of course negatively impacts Latinos and African Americans. I do want to show that apportionment, redistricting, gerrymandering are often used interchangeably. They are not. They are very distinct terms. Apportionment, and I don't really have the time to get into all of these, but they are all very interesting to understand how they work their way through. And then finally, one of the ways to make redistricting the fairest possible is not to have the elected representatives themselves. Representatives shouldn't be choosing the voters. Voters should be choosing representatives. By having a citizens commission, as we do in California, should be more fairer. But even that process, as many of you might have read over the last month, became incredibly where the first 8 members of this 13-member commission were all non-Latinos, and they said, and the likelihood of that happening on a lottery basis was less than 1%. Yet it happened. It was a very interesting dynamic. Go to the next one. Go ahead. Then we have these other conventional recommendations. I talked about off-cycle elections. So myself and the Center for the Study of LA worked with the City of Los Angeles, and I was actually appointed the chair of the Electoral Reform Commission for the City of Los Angeles in 2015. Mayor Garcetti called me and asked me if I would be on this commission. I told him no, that I didn't think I wanted to be, etc. And he said, well, not leaving you off the hook, just think about it. I said, okay, I'll think about it. Then about 2 or 3 days later, I got a call from a council member, the president of the council, and said, hey, you're on this commission. I said, no, I was going to think about it. He completely continued to ignore me and told me what I had to do, where I was going to show up, and therefore I became president of this Electoral Reform Commission. And because I had been arguing that we had to change the city elections from off year to even year so that they're held at the same time. And so this is what I brought together, all of the research. I convinced the city council that this was the way to go. And I then got them to put it on the ballot. The voters in an off-year election, ironically, voted 70% overwhelmingly to accept this recommendation and shift the elections to the even year. And so we talked, let me give you some examples about this. I'll go to the next slide. So this is a line graph that shows the turnout in city elections for LA mayor, okay? And you can see back in the late 60s, to be very specific, 1969, the turnout was in the high 70s, for mayor of Los Angeles. And then you go all the way to the last re-election of Mayor Garcetti, it was only 23%. So you could see a tremendous decline in voter participation that is happening here. Now, one of the things that's happening here is that in 1969, we had a very contentious election. It was the first election for mayor after the Watts riots. We had an African-American candidate, Tom Bradley, running for the first time. We had a very conservative incumbent mayor, Sam Yorty, and it was a very contentious, racist, red-baiting debate, and everybody came out to either vote for the black guy or vote against the black guy. And that's what happened. You had a 69 because everybody knew, okay? What you see over the years is the city become much more democratic, much more, again, that consensus that I earlier talked about, so that by the time you got to a competitive election, like in 2013, when Eric Garcetti first got elected, who did he run against? He ran against Wendy Gruhl. And who were they? They were two very progressive Democratic leaders who agreed, if I were to put down the 10 most important issues facing Los Angeles, the two of them would have agreed on all 10 issues. So is it that people are disengaged, or is it that they say, hey, it doesn't really matter whether Eric Garcetti or Wendy Gruhl would win? Now, obviously the supporters of Eric Garcetti or Wendy Gruhl say, no, it's a big difference. But in reality, it wasn't. They were both liberal Democrats who would have pursued 95 to 99% of the same policies. Let's take a look at the next slide. Now, this is an off-year non-mayoral election. So we talked about staggered terms before. So during an election for mayor, half the city council gets elected. 2 years later, the other half of the city council gets elected in a staggered term, but no mayor is running. And so we elected half of the Los Angeles City Council with a turnout rate as low as not even ever hitting 20% in the last 20 years. And in the runoffs, going as low as single digits. And in some districts, the turnout was as low as 5%. And so people arguing that we should continue to have these elections in the odd year, not during the presidential, this is the results that you would get. These were regularly scheduled elections every 4 years when there is not the president, not the governor, not the mayor running, but we are electing half of the Los Angeles City Council, half of the Los Angeles Unified School Board, and half of the Los Angeles Community College Board. They were being elected in this type of a turnout where many times less than 10% of the population of registered voters, let alone the population, were coming out to vote. And this is what I was arguing against, that it made no sense in a democratic society to have a structure that allowed for this type of a turnout. Next. Now, this is a very, very busy graph. All I want you to pay attention to is just one line, and that's the top line. What is that top line? That top line is the presidential election. And look how consistent it's been, all the way from 1996 to 2016. And this is just for Los Angeles City, or the Los Angeles region. And so you can see that voters have been very consistent in turning out for presidential elections. All the other lines are for statewide, state, city, county elections. And it shows you all the different turnouts. And so my whole idea was, look, forget all these other elections. Let's just move the elections where the voters are. Where are the voters? They're at that red line. And so let's have the election at that red line. And people would say, no, the strongest argument against doing that was that the election then for city council or school board would be lost in the national debate over president. And my argument was, what do you mean? It's already lost. Let's say only 10% of the people paid attention to the local races. That's what you were having before, okay? And then number two, given how democratic in a one-party state we've become, people in Los Angeles County aren't listening to Donald Trump. And maybe not even listening to Biden. They've already made up their mind. So they have the capacity and the time to listen to other elections, because the national elections, the elections for president, for Congress, for US Senate has already been decided in their mind. And so you will see very few commercials in Los Angeles for Donald Trump or for Joe Biden, because neither one of those campaigns are going to spend money to a state that's already decided. And so the airwaves will really be about the propositions and local races. So that's a kind of a argument against the local races being drawn out, drawn that people don't listen to them. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so I had a very interesting conversation. A friend of my wife called me literally 2 weeks ago, and she said, "Hey, I want to help get the vote out. So what's where do I go to help?" And I said, "Well, there is no government agency." She goes, "What do you mean there's no government agency?" There is no government agency in getting the vote out. Yes, the Secretary of State and the Registrar Recorder will inform you of when the election is, where your polling location is, or now where the voting centers all are, and they will give you and send you information about the candidate statements and the propositions one time, and that is it, okay? But they will not, on election day, tell you to go out and vote. That is left up to different organizations like the political party, political campaigns, and oftentimes, as we know here, everybody's gonna vote for Biden, and so that's gonna be really different. One of the things that we are recommending is that there be an official government entity within the Secretary of State or within the Registrar Recorder to officially get the vote out. This friend of mine wanted to volunteer to drive people to the polls in this pandemic era if they needed to. But now, instead of going to an official government neutral entity that would get out the vote, you have to go to a campaign that's getting out the vote for a specific candidate, to a political party who's getting out the vote for a particular type of voters, or to nonprofits that really don't have the wherewithal to identify those that haven't that need to go to the polls. All right, and so that's one of our more not conventional per se, but it's starting to be a conventional. Let me move on to what I consider some unconventional recommendations. Number one, allow non-citizens to vote. Okay, the U.S. Constitution does not prohibit non-citizens from voting in local office. As a matter of fact, most cities and states early on in our political history allowed non-citizens to vote because there were so many of them. The U.S. Constitution does prohibit them from voting for president, U.S. Senate, and U.S. House, but not voting for governor, etc. And so in many localities, they had that privilege. Even today, the state of Maryland allows their cities to allow non-citizens to vote, and there are at least 5 cities in Maryland that allow non-citizens to vote. In addition, you're seeing San Francisco has been experimenting with that for their school board, and that's been the main argument. Allow non-citizens to vote for school board, because they're the ones that are sending their children, and the majority of children in some school districts are the children of immigrants. And one of the things that we know that our great School of Education and others have completely proven to be the case is that one of the great indicators of student success is parent involvement. And the first thing the political system says to immigrant parents is, you cannot be involved in the selection of those who are going to make public policy in your school district. So we're great advocates for the non-citizen immigrants to vote in school board elections, especially if they have children in those, okay? Even we're kind of moving in that direction. We do have neighborhood councils in the city of Los Angeles, and we allow non-citizens to vote in that. And then increasingly, we have non-citizens serving as commissioners for cities, and now even statewide commissions, where the governor has recently appointed a non-citizen to serve on a commission. Nothing prohibits that from happening. The next one. Another unconventional recommendation would be mandatory voting. You see that in countries like Australia, Switzerland, etc. I am actually against this because one of the things about those type of countries is that they're incredibly homogeneous. There's some diversity, but not that much diversity. And one of the things that the way you do mandatory voting is that if you don't vote, they penalize you. And in part, one of the problems we're having is having poor people vote, homeless people vote. They're less likely to vote, even if it's mandatory. Now we're going to find them even more and further suppress them. So not in favor of the mandatory voting. Internet voting. No system has been approved, given what we've seen with hacking and with Russian interference, or if you want to give it some to Trump, also Chinese and Iranian and North Korean interference. It all speaks to the fact that we probably will not do internet voting anytime soon. When the internet first came along, I was a strong advocate. I would make the argument that, hey, if we trust our ATMs, if we trust the transferring of tens of millions of dollars to the internet, how could we not trust the voting system? I soon learned that there's actually a lot of fraud and a lot of things that happen with some of that money. So I said, okay, I'm convinced, no internet voting. By the way, what Los Angeles County has instituted is not internet voting. You are using computer tablets, but they're not hooked up to the internet. Okay, they're only being used electronically to pull up all the different types of ballots, and also for you to record your vote. It then prints out it prints out your actual ballot, and that's what you submit into the ballot box. So there's no way that the internet is connected to those. Okay. Next, it is an idea that we played with at the Center for the Study of LA. We call it Voteria. And let's go to the next slide so we can talk a little bit about this very unconventional recommendation. What is Voteria? It would be a drawing of a voter who would win a significant cash prize of about $25,000 and randomly selected if you vote. The effort would be managed by a nonprofit, not the city or the state. And all the voter would have to do was literally go vote. There's no need to keep a stub. There's no need to do anything else, but actually go vote. How do we work on this? So every time you go vote, it's public record. And we know every single person who has voted. And when I say we, I'm talking about the registrar recorder, academics who use these lists, campaign managers. I could actually look up and find out if you have voted in the last election. And that's actually how campaigns end up reaching out. They actually take a look at all these voter lists and they say, hey, there's voter X has voted in the last 5 elections. We're pretty sure they're going to vote this coming November, so we're going to target them. Using those same lists, we can see everybody who voted in the last election, randomly draw a voter and give them a prize, okay? And then we would advertise this tremendously that you could win by simply going out and voting. And of course, Latinos and Asians communities especially love the lottery for a variety of different reasons, and they would be something that could actually drive this theory. But it's not only a theory. The next slide, we actually put this into practice. The center with a nonprofit that actually liked the idea, they put it into practice, but they had us do the research. There was a special election not a special, a runoff election in the LA Unified, where we actually had a nonprofit come up with a donor who gave $25,000 to the Senate, to the nonprofit to give to the winner. And then they also funded some research where we did an exit poll of the voters, and then also did a couple of mailers telling them about this. And then the bottom line is our research showed that voter participation increased, and it had a real impact in that potential election. The city of Philadelphia heard about our experiment, asked us about it, and they actually put it into practice in 2017 one time. Now, there are some legal questions about it being used in a federal election, and therefore it cannot be used if there's a member of Congress on the ballot, and therefore that's why it had to be in an off-year election. which of course then contradicts what I was talking about earlier, moving all these local elections to even when you couldn't do that. But nonetheless, we tried it, it worked, it was an experiment, and we got a lot of flack by that. There were actually several editorials written in the Los Angeles Times and the late Daily News, which called our idea crazy. It was not that people should not be paid for going out to vote. Of course, our response was that people weren't going to be paid. It was just one person, not plural. It was very different than paying people $10, $15 each. And then, of course, my other response was that money is what drives political campaigns. All elected officials are doing is constantly raising money, and they're spending that money on ads. So money impacts everything that has to do with American politics, unfortunately. I said, why not give some of the money to the voters? They're the ones that never get that. So let me take a look at the last slide, I think.
And Dr. Guerra, there's one question that's already in the Q&A, and that'll be the only question we'll have time for. So,
all right, let's hear that question. Anyway, the consequences of Voteria is that it can, from our data, it reflected a little bit more diversity. And I'll leave. Let's see the next slide that we have. All right, I kept going on because I knew there was only one question, but I would welcome more. Let's hear that question.
Okay, great. So the question is, I speak to high school and college students all the time, and they're very skeptical about Biden-Harris. What would you say to inspire, energize a young Latino electorate who is totally resigned about the Democratic presidential ticket? Yes.
So this is, of course, a challenge. I have to agree with some of those students because Biden was not my first choice, wasn't even in my top three. Harris was not my first choice, it wasn't even in my top three. But what comes with an administration are hundreds of thousands of appointees to run government agencies, and not to mention the judiciary. And so while Biden and Harris may not be as progressive or pushing some of the issues that you would like, but they're appointees from secretaries of housing and urban development and secretaries of transportation to undersecretaries to people who are going to be running ICE or people who are going to be running the Attorney General's office, the judges that are going to be appointed. They are all going to be much more progressive than anything Donald Trump would appoint. The U.S. government is not just the president or the vice president. The U.S. government is hundreds of thousands of people who are implementing and making discretionary decisions every single day. A judge is deciding whether or not to jail a young black man or a young Latino man for life or not. And I could tell you that there's a big difference between a Trump-appointed judge and a Biden-appointed judge, and that will greatly impact communities of color. And so while you may not like Biden, you will much more likely be supportive of who his appointees are and the policies that he's going to pursue.
There's one question that popped up, so I'll ask this one, and then I'm looking forward to you just sharing a bit about the election series that's coming up.
Sure.
So the final question is, why is the primary restricted to the individual's political party? It limits the choices for candidates.
Yeah, it's interesting. It used to be, obviously, you weren't even elections and primaries. There were conventions, right? And then they started having more primaries. In California, they're actually what we call semi-open, in that the law allows the parties to decide who they were allowed to vote besides their own registrants. So in California, for instance, in the Democratic Party, both Democrats and independents and anybody from any other party is allowed to, except for Republicans, is allowed to vote in the Democratic primary. Republicans, given the same choice, said, no, we only want Republicans. And so the idea there is that only Democrats should choose who the Democratic nominee is. Only Republicans should choose who the Democratic nominee is. But in practice, we know that there's really only two parties, and we should be able to have that choice. Historically, we saw political parties not as government entities. They're not government run, they're not government funded, they're not government appointed. They are actually private associations and have the right to choose their own members. And that was the thinking very early on. But then things have changed as these primary elections and political parties became very exclusive, including in the South, where they literally excluded African Americans from voting in the white-only primary. But they clearly had the impact of who was going to be on the ballot. And so after many different pieces of legislation, many court decisions, they've become more open, and we've seen a tremendous amount. And so here in California, we've also added what we call the top two. And so you're not privileged as a political party to have your candidate in the November election. So we saw, let's say in 2018, where you had the US Senate race in the runoff was two Democrats, not a Democrat and a Republican. If you recall, it was the incumbent Dianne Feinstein and then State Senator Kevin De Leon who made the runoff. That really impacted the power of the political parties. So things are changing dramatically, and you're seeing more and more legislation that is taking away the power of political parties. So we really haven't decided, just like my other recommendation about having a more government be in charge of turnout and getting the vote out, that's the role of the political parties, but they're not doing a great job. So government should take over. And maybe in the primaries, we shouldn't have the political parties decide that we have an Iowa caucus and then this New Hampshire primary, which are crazy, but that's the political parties and their right to do that.
Thank you.
We are going to have a lecture series. Mike Genovese, my colleague in political science, and Jessica Levison, my colleague from the law school, the three of us are team teaching a class that's really from 6:30 to 8. And we'll have several guest lecturers, and we'll let you guys know about that. But for sure, two dates that we're going to have is the week before the election. We're going to have election forecast, basically forecasting who we think is going to win certain elections. And we're also going to do a survey of about 20 to 30 very well-known individuals and get and collate their answers and give those results out on October 28th. And then on November 10th, we're going to have a postmortem and say who won and why, and take a look at that and do an analysis of that. So we welcome, there'll be many more diverse voices. It won't be just me rambling. We'll have at least two other faculty members and a lot of guests and some panel discussion. So please join us during that time. Look for this website right there that's under there that will give you the times, and by then we'll have who will be our guests.
Thank you so much, Dr. Guerra. I think a lot of us have learned a lot. So the time you took to sort of walk us through the issues, the processes, and everything was really phenomenal. So thank you for saying yes.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And this was my short version. I could actually kept going.
Well, thank you for saying yes, because we knew that you had a lot to offer, and I appreciate that you've taken some time, and I know this is a busy time, so I really appreciate that you've taken some time. I just also want to give a special thanks out to the BCLA team, Janet Vida Lopez, who's with us today,
Yes, thanks, Janet.
and other folks who are helping us make this series successful. So we will look forward to seeing many of you next week, and thank you for joining us. Take care.
Thanks.